Hi, I'm Anna and welcome back to my channel. Today we are reviewing the final book, finally, of the Grisha trilogy, or the Shadow and Bone trilogy by Leigh Bardugo, Rune and Rising. I would recommend, if you're just coming into this video, to watch the first two that I've done of this series because it won't make much sense if you watch this video. As I did in my previous video, I'm going to be dividing this into a non-spoiler review and a spoiler review. So this book picks up after the end of the previous one. Mal and Alina are underground, having been rescued by the weird cult that is led by the Apparat. Their goal in this book is to find the Firebird and get enough power to defeat the Darkling. That's pretty much the focus of this book. Let me just get this out of the way. I liked this book so much better than the previous two. I ended up giving it 4 stars on Goodreads as opposed to 2 stars for the first book and 3 stars for the second book. So clearly the series just gets better as you continue reading it. I went between like, is it closer to 4 stars? Is it closer to 3 stars? And I decided for me, enjoyment wise, it was closer to 4 stars. Even if I still had some issues with it, I still enjoyed it a lot better than the previous 2 books. There's not much new to say. We don't learn that much more about the world. We learn a lot more about the characters, which I'll get to in a minute. But when it comes to the magic system, I was a little bit disappointed that we didn't really learn much about how the magic worked, why the Darkling and Alina had so many powers, whereas most Grisha didn't have that many powers. And I was kind of disappointed that even by the end, we didn't learn where Alina's powers came from and why she has so many powers. We kind of learned why the Darkling has so many powers, but not her. Let's get to the characters and if they got better or worse. There's quite a few background characters that we received more information of in this book, or they received more of a backstory in this book. So I really enjoyed that. But for the main characters, there wasn't a drastic change, but there were small changes that I kind of liked. For example, Alina is very much more focused in this book. She has a clear goal in mind. She wants to find the Firebird. She wants to defeat the Darkling. When it came to Mal, I raved about him in the last 2 reviews that I wasn't really a big fan of him, not only as the main love interest, but as a character in general. But in this book, he was definitely more likable. He didn't do as stupid, frustrating things in this one. He was pretty generic in this one, but he also wasn't bad. So I didn't hate him as much as I did in the last 2 books. The Darkling didn't really change, but Bardugo did try to add this strange character arc for his character that has to do with his real name, and I'll get to that more in the spoiler section. But for me, I felt like she was trying to make him more relatable, but it just came across as, why is this happening now when he didn't do any of this in the previous 2 books? So the final character, I guess that's the main character, is Nikolai, who is the prince, the younger son of Ravka, and he's probably my favorite character in the entire series, which I guess is not much of a competition because I didn't like many of the main characters, but he's just such a fun, likable character. He has all these quirky one-liners, and he also has very strong motivation to protect his kingdom, and he cares about people, whether it is Alina or the Grisha or his people or even his parents. His father's kind of a horrible human being, and yet he still cares about him and loves him. The plot was by far the part of this book that stood out against the other books, and I think that's why I like the characters so much, because in the first 2 books we were kind of stuck with the characters for so long that they had a chance to be teen angsty. But in this one, because it's much quicker paced, I never felt like the plot stagnated or that we were stuck in one place for too long. We traveled from place to place to place. And maybe the reason I enjoyed this book so much was not because it was a great book, but more because compared to the first 2 books, it was really good. Now, that was the non-spoiler review. So let us get into the spoiler review now. So before I get into summarizing the plot, I want to just talk about my predictions that I had for the previous book and whether they came true or not for the third book. The first one is learning the background of Alina and Mal's parents. I knew something had to be going on with why Mal was such an amazing tracker and why Alina had all these powers. And I was really happy that they gave us the background of not only Mal, but much more about the Darkling. And I loved that. My only disappointment was we never learned about Alina and her past and where her magic came from and what family she was descended from or anything. We never learned anything about that, and I was a little bit disappointed with that. We did find out about why Mal was able to find the first two amplifiers relatively easily. We also learned why, or at least it was reasonably explained why the Darkling had a lot of these extra powers. But for Alina, we didn't learn much more about her, and I was disappointed about that. The second prediction I had for this third book was that the Fold would be destroyed and would also be more of a focus in this book, because in the second book, it wasn't a very big focus, and I was right about that, and I'm so happy that that was the case, that both the Fold is destroyed at the end of the third book, and there is also more focus on it. I won't say it was the main focus, but it had a much bigger part to play in the story, and the third act, the final conclusion, took place mostly in the Fold. The third prediction I had was the Darkling would die or be destroyed. And yes, that did happen. I will say that I would have never predicted that he would have died the way he did. Spoilers. I mean, we are in the spoiler section, so I was a little bit disappointed with how anticlimactic his death was, but it also fit, so I can't be too mad at it. And then the final prediction I have was about the love square between the Darkling, Nikolai, Alina, and Mal. So I predicted that Mal and the Darkling would die and Alina would end up with Nikolai. That was kind of the case, but not the case. The Darkling and Mal did die, but then Mal kind of rose from the dead again. I'll get to that in a minute. And so Alina and Mal ended up marrying in the end, and Nikolai ruled the kingdom. So I was a little bit disappointed that Alina didn't end up with Nikolai. Not that I thought that they were perfectly paired together. I just liked Nikolai the best. So out of all the guys, he seemed the best person for Alina to end up with. Let's get to the summary of the plot. So the story starts off, like I said at the beginning of this review, with them underground. They have escaped the Darkling, and I said in the last video, I said you always double tap the villain, okay? You always make sure they're dead. No, they didn't. They left him there, and now he's taken over the entire kingdom. And Alina and Mal and the surviving Grisha of the second army from the previous book are now hiding underground. The apparat is kind of in charge, and the cult is growing, and more people are joining them underground to build this army, which I was a little bit disappointed in, because I thought that this growing army and the cult would play a bigger role in the rest of the book, and no, it didn't at all. You know, at the end of the book, a few of the, cult members came to help Alina in the final battle with the Darkling, but besides that, they're never mentioned again except in passing of, yeah, the apparat's kind of a douchebag, but besides that, we're going to ignore that. Another thing that is mentioned in the very beginning and then never brought up again is this giant worm that is legendary, that is living in the underground. Izumrad, I believe it is named. It is mentioned as making a lot of the tunnels, and that a lot of the cult members can't go further out into the tunnels because they're afraid they're going to be eaten by this worm. And yet we never hear mention of the worm again. I feel like that's a kind of big thing just to pull out in the first chapter of the book, and then we never hear about it for the rest of the book. I was a little bit disappointed about that, especially when I heard that. I was like, ooh, are they going to use it to fight the Darkling? Are they going to have to kill it? What's going on? And then it was just ignored for the rest of the book. Another thing that was a little bit disappointing with how it was brought up again was at the end of the second book, and I really loved this twist. Alina realizes she can't use her magic after she gets underground. So I was really excited to see, well, why can't she use her powers? Is she going to have to rediscover her powers? Is her conflict with the Darkling what caused her to lose her powers? No, None of that. It's just because she's underground and there's not enough light. I was so disappointed with that because here I was thinking it was going to be a big issue in the book that she's lost her powers, now she needs to regain them, and that's just not addressed. She gets her power fine as soon as they escape from underground, and it's not an issue for the rest of the book, which I especially hate with how the third book ends because, spoiler alert, she ends up losing her powers at the end of this book, and it makes no sense for them to have the ending of the second book be she can't call on her powers. Maybe it was supposed to be a big foreshadowing of how the third book ends, but I really feel like for the both books to end the exact same way, with Alina realizing she doesn't have her powers anymore. It was really disappointing, and I wish the second book did not have that included because it was really interesting, but it was resolved so quickly in the third book. I couldn't see any reasoning for why you should include it as being this big issue at the end of the second book when it's such a quick fix at the beginning of the third book. One thing that was really interesting is because of her conflict with the Darkling at the end of the second book, where she ends up drawing on his power to create the Nichivoya, these monsters, she ends up pulling some of his magic into her. She can summon shadows now, and I really loved that twist. And it actually explained, it's one of the few times where the magic of Alina and the Darkling are actually explained where she got it. Because yes, it makes sense if you like go inside someone's magic and pull out their magic that you're going to have some remnant of that. So anyway, they're underground. They end up getting in conflict with the Apparat and they defeat him. She's able to call on her powers somehow, and they are able to escape the tunnels and get above ground. They run into some raiders or smugglers, and they end up getting rescued by Nikolai. Of course, Nikolai, and he's been in hiding. He's taken back West Ravka from the Darkling, and the reason that the Darkling can't really come get him is because the fold is in between West Ravka and where the Darkling is, and the Darkling can't just travel through the fold without Alina. And when they get to Nikolai's base, it's really cool because he's working on a bunch of technology. There's like this rickety elevator type thing, and we also get to see Bakra come back, which she was my favorite character in the first book, and she didn't really play that big of a role in the second book. I think there was only 1 or 2 scenes where she was in it, but in the third book, she has been rescued by Nikolai and brought here, and so she ends up training Alina for a little bit, which very much parallels the first book where she trained Alina for a short period of time. And as this is going on, Alina is still being able to have these visions of the Darkling. In a sense, she is able to project herself into the place where he is so she can talk to him. So she ends up doing that, and a couple things happen. He admits that he's going to go through the fold. He has found this new power that one of the Grisha that works with Alina is named David. I may have mentioned him in the previous 2 books because he was in both books, and he is really great. I believe he's a fabricator, so pretty much he makes things and builds things. And he invented this type of light that you could use to go through the fold safely. And the Darkling discovers his notes and pretty much tells Alina, yeah, I'm going to take over West Ravka. He also tells her, and this is where this silly subplot comes in, he tells her that his name is Alexander. And he really wants her to know it because his name he hasn't told to anyone for probably centuries. Now, why he wants her to know, I'm not sure. Maybe he doesn't want to be forgotten. You see that a little bit later when he's dying. He's like, say my name, don't forget me, stuff like that. But I don't know. It's very weird to bring in this theme in the third book when we haven't seen any of this introspection within him in the first 2 books. And while they are in Nikolai's headquarters, we learn something else that is very important. Mortsalva, I believe they pronounce his name, and he was several thousand years ago the most powerful Grisha. He was the one who wrote about the 3 amplifiers. He is this big legendary figure, and Baghra, the mother of the Darkling, reveals to Alina that her father was Morozov. So she is obviously really old, and what happened was she became, for some reason, jealous of her sister, and Baghra had these dark powers. She ended up doing the cut, which I mentioned in previous reviews. It pretty much just means you cut a person to pieces. And she ends up doing that to her sister out of a lash of anger, and of course, killing her. And her father ends up putting the girl back together and resurrecting her, which all the villagers are shocked when they see this and think it is dark magic. They're very superstitious. They were very much more superstitious about Grisha powers back then, so they end up tossing her father and her sister into the river, and she never sees them again. It is clear later on, I'll get to, that her sister survived somehow, but we do not know if her father did, which seems like a big thing. I thought he was going to come back in, but it's never mentioned again. And that was really interesting to learn about Baghra's family and Darkling's family, because we learn, yes, he got his dark powers from her, and she never uses her dark powers anymore because she's seen what dark powers did to her sister, as well as what they did later to her son. Of course, in these scenes, they have to add a little bit of teen angst, which I really hate why Bardugo still includes that in this series, because it does not need it. This would have been so much a better series if it had less emphasis on their weird romance. But anyway, Alina kisses Nikolai even though she claims to still love Mal, and she almost kisses the Darkling, and of course she's kissing Mal. So it's, girlfriend, just, if you love Mal, you love Mal. You don't go around kissing other guys, okay? But it is a little bit annoying to have this really potent scene of Baghra telling of her background and of what greed led to for her family. And then the next scene, or the next couple scenes later, Alina is like making out with Nikolai, and it was just really annoying. The next, I guess, turn of things is when one of the Grisha that Alina is traveling with, Sergio ends up betraying them to the Darkling, and so he attacks them. He ends up putting this darkness inside of Nikolai, which turns him into this winged black monster. So the Darkling is about to capture Alina, probably kill Mal. He's already turned Nikolai into a monster who now lusts after human flesh. So Nikolai flies off into, the cloud of blackness of the Nichevoya, and Baghra enters. Now Baghra is blind. She was blinded by the Darkling at the end of the first book because she helped Alina escape for the capital city. So she goes up to the Nichevoya, and they sense that she is, in a sense, their kind. There's this quote that's said throughout the entire series, like cause to like, and it pretty much means that darkness or power caused to other power. And so for Baghra, she's able to just approach the Nichevoya. They won't hurt her, and she just ends up like petting them or like touching them gently, and it's really bizarre. And so she realizes that they're focused on her, so she ends up throwing herself off a cliff, probably to her death. We never see her again, so I assume she's dead. And the Nichevoya fly after her. So in that moment, Alina and Mal and a few of the other people end up being able to escape. They go in search of the Firebird that's supposed to be the last amplifier. So Alina really wants to get the last amplifier. She doesn't want all these people who have died to, in a sense, have their lives wasted. So she ends up finding the Firebird. And it's then that she realizes the Firebird was not the third amplifier. And this is the big twist. And I loved this twist. Might I say that the way they figure this out is not quite clear, because Alina just seems to kind of automatically figure it out. And we're never really told what her rationale in figuring it out is, but she figures out that Mal is the last amplifier. Turns out Baghra's sister must have lived, and Baghra's sister was the third amplifier. When Morozova healed his daughter and brought her back to life, she became this essence of his power, this third amplifier. And her descendant is Mal. I wish they gave more reasoning to why they were able to figure it out, but they figure it out, and obviously they leave the Firebird, and Mal turns to Alina, and he's like, eventually you're going to have to kill me. Because that is the only way, because in order for Alina to gain his power, she has to kill him. The same way she did with the stag in the first book, and the sea dragon in the second book. And she refuses to, of course, and in the meantime, the Darkling takes over West Ravka, and the place where Alina and Mal were raised, this duke's castle where he would take in these orphans, the Darkling ends up taking it over, killing all the adults, and taking the orphans and saying, you, Alina, come into the fold to save these orphans, or I'm going to kill them. So they concoct a plan, they get this flying ship, they end up sailing into the fold. Invisibly, they're able to do some stuff, which was really cool how that worked. And then they attack the Darkling. Of course, things don't go as they should. Turns out he didn't even bring the orphans on board. He hid them far away, so they're safe. Alina ends up jumping off it's called a skiff. There's this heated battle around her. Mal comes over to her. He gives her the knife. He's like, take it, plunge it into my heart. So she unwillingly plunges it into his heart, and so he dies there. And what happens? Because technically now she has 3 amplifiers. And this is the big twist. Because it's mentioned earlier on, Bagra says it, I believe, that when you have the 3rd amplifier, your magic will be expanded 1,000-fold or something like that. So what happens is, it's not Alina's power that gets more powerful. Her power kind of breaks out of her and is given to every single other Grisha. Which, let me just say, it didn't make sense. If that was the case, would not then the Grisha that were following the Darkling also get more powerful? And the Darkling himself get more powerful? But that's never mentioned. I don't know, maybe it's just the good people, the good in heart. But so the power breaks out of her and enters all of the other Grisha that are fighting with her, and so now suddenly they're much more powerful and they can take on and destroy the Darkling. The Darkling comes over to her and he's absolutely shocked, and he sees that the amplifier that was around her neck and around her wrist, the first 2 amplifiers, have now fallen off her and are shattered on the ground. And so it is in that moment that she takes the knife that killed Mal, stabs the Darkling straight through the heart, and he just goes down. Let me just say, for such a powerful villain throughout these 3 books, he went down being stabbed with, technically it was made out of Grisha steel, but with a plain knife by a girl who now has no powers. Let me just say, it doesn't make sense for Alina to have absolutely no powers anymore. It makes sense for her to have lost all the powers she gained by the amplifiers being on. However, I do not understand why she would automatically lose all her powers and become, in a sense, a non-Grisha, a non-magic user. She can no longer ever use her magic again. For me, that didn't make sense as much. Also, because for some reason, Mal is kind of resurrected. He just comes back to life. It made more sense for him to come back to life because the amplifier inside him was killed or released, but he himself was not. So he comes back fully human, so he doesn't have his tracker abilities that he did before. But at least for him to go from having these powers directly resulting from being the amplifier to having no powers, it made sense. But for Alina, I didn't really understand why she went from having some powers, and then she gains more as she gets more of the amplifiers, to having no powers. So of course they win in the end because of course, and the fold becomes to unravel, and so the darkness is gone, the Nichevoya are gone, and Nikolai is now on the throne, and Alina ends up to pretend as if she has died within the fold because she no longer has magic. And she ends up marrying Mal, going to work for the Duke that raised her, and living in his castle, raising the orphans, living an ordinary life with Mal, but still receiving some visitors of the other Grisha who were friends with her. And Nikolai ends up on the throne. The last line is kind of silly. It says, "They had an ordinary life, full of ordinary things, if love can ever be called that." Like, yeah, where was love when you were flirting with all these other guys? That's what I want to know. But all jokes aside, I really did enjoy this book a lot more. I think it was because the plot was more quick-paced, action-oriented. A lot of the focus was taken off of the teen angst elements. They were definitely still present, but they weren't in your face as much, and I really enjoyed that. It definitely wasn't a perfect book by any means, but it is kind of ironic that from the first book to the third book, the series for me got better, which I was kind of surprised about that, because usually I have the opposite thoughts of a series. Usually I like the first book and then the series goes down from there. That has been the case with 90% of series I have read. So this is my thoughts about the series in general. I definitely felt like the first book was pretty filled with angsty tropes. There were a lot of interesting things there, but it wasn't super developed. I love the world, but I didn't really like the characters that much, and I really disliked the angsty tropes. The second one got a little bit better. There were still those angsty tropes, but the plot was a lot more interesting, and the third book had even less angsty tropes and even better plot and better characters. And my theory about it was that Leigh Bardugo, this book, Shadow and Bone, was her debut novel. So she'd never published before. Maybe she was more of an inexperienced writer. She learned a lot while publishing this series. And I've read her Six of Crows duology, and I really enjoyed that. And that was published after this series was finished. So I have a feeling that maybe she was just trying to get better at writing and getting more practice, in a sense, perfecting her craft and getting better. And I felt like I could clearly see that in this series, because the first book, meh, pretty bad, okay, some ways. The second book, decent. The third book, actually enjoyable. So maybe this is just my opinion, and you're welcome to disagree with me. I would love to hear your thoughts of this series. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Subscribe. Like this video, hit the bell notification to be notified when I post. I post every Saturday at 6 p.m. and I'm so glad to be done with doing these reviews. I'm so happy to go on to other videos, because I feel like for the last month, my channel has been focused on reviewing this series, and I will be glad to be done soon. So I will see you all in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great week. Bye!